My name is Malik, and I'll be your narrator today, exclusively for the Red Beret channel. He said it like it was nothing, in front of reporters, on camera. The words that left Donald Trump's mouth made millions of Africans freeze. Africa is nothing. It has no value. The insult echoed through headlines, talk shows, and dinner tables, but no one expected what came next. Because from deep inside West Africa, a man named Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward, not with anger, not with threats, but with a response so powerful, so unforgettable, that it made the world pause. You see, this story isn't just about a careless comment. It's about history. It's about pride. And it's about the moment one man reminded the world why Africa is everything. Before we dive into his unforgettable reply, you need to understand the man behind the message. Ibrahim Traoré isn't a politician molded by privilege. He was born in Burkina Faso, in a world where children grow up fast, where dreams aren't given, they're fought for. He trained as a soldier, served with courage, and witnessed firsthand the pain of injustice, poverty, and foreign exploitation. But instead of being crushed by the weight of it all, he rose. In 2022, Traoré took bold action. Amid growing instability and foreign interference, he led a movement, not just to change leadership, but to change the country's destiny. He became the world's youngest president, but age had nothing to do with his strength. He brought a new kind of fire, a fearless voice, and an unshakable promise to restore dignity and power to the people of Africa. So when Trump's dismissive remark hit global headlines, Traoré knew silence wasn't an option, not for himself, not for his people. It happened in the middle of a press conference in Washington, surrounded by reporters, cameras, and flashing lights. A journalist had raised a question about the United States' long-term interests in Africa, specifically asking whether the US would increase investments in the continent in response to growing Chinese and Russian influence. Donald Trump, leaning back in his chair, waved his hand dismissively and let out a laugh that was half smirk, half scoff. Then, with the same casual tone he had used countless times before to shock the world, he said, "Why would we? Africa is nothing. What do they have? Chaos, corruption, poverty. They've got nothing we need." The words came out sharp, careless, and cutting. The room went silent for a brief second, stunned. Some reporters laughed nervously, others scribbled down quotes with wide eyes. But the cameras had caught it, the microphones had recorded it, and within minutes, the clip had made its way to social media. Within hours, the phrase, "Africa is nothing," began trending globally. African leaders were blindsided. In the streets of Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Bamako, people stared at their phones in disbelief. The insult didn't feel like mere ignorance, it felt deliberate, a dismissal of centuries of culture, resistance, beauty, and struggle. In university lecture halls, students debated the deeper meaning. Was it just Trump being Trump, or was it a symptom of a deeper mindset, one that saw Africa not as a continent of potential, but as a footnote in the global story? Across Burkina Faso, the reaction was immediate and fierce. On the radio, hosts played the clip over and over, each time with growing anger. In cafes, people whispered, heads shaking. Social media pages filled with responses from African youth, poetry, artwork, videos, all expressing a collective fury masked beneath years of restrained dignity. And while outrage grew across Africa and its diaspora, the Western world treated it like just another news cycle. Some pundits on American news networks brushed it off. "It's just Trump being provocative," one analyst said. "He didn't mean it literally." But in Africa, it was felt literally. For a continent that had fought so long to define itself on its own terms, to be reduced to nothing by a former president of one of the most powerful nations on earth, was more than just offensive. It was a slap in the face of history. But this wasn't just about pride. It wasn't just about one man's insult. It was about a narrative, one that had been written without African voices for far too long. A narrative that painted the continent as a victim, a burden, a place in need of saving or exploitation. And it was that narrative that Ibrahim Traoré recognized in Trump's words. He saw the danger in letting that statement go unanswered. Not because he needed to defend Africa's value to Trump. No. Traoré understood that Trump's opinion didn't define Africa, but the silence that might follow it could allow the world to continue believing it. So he made a choice, a bold one. While other leaders issued carefully worded diplomatic statements or avoided comment altogether, Ibrahim Traoré chose to speak directly. Not through a spokesperson, not through a social media post, but through a public, globally broadcasted address. It was a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. "You're taking a big risk," one had told him. "Why amplify what he said?" But Traoré knew better. He understood the power of silence. He understood that when someone tries to erase your value, your refusal to speak becomes agreement. And so, he prepared not just a reply, but a statement that would redefine the conversation entirely. Across Burkina Faso, anticipation built quickly. News broke that the president would be making a speech, not about policy, not about war or economics, but about dignity, about Africa. International media began to pay attention. Could this young leader really be taking on Donald Trump? Would he retaliate? Would he lash out with insults of his own? No one could predict what was coming. But those who knew Ibrahim Traoré best understood one thing. He was not going to respond with anger. He was going to respond with history, with truth, and with something the world didn't expect. A calm, precise, and unshakably powerful reminder of who Africa is, was, and will always be. As the hour of the speech approached, millions across the globe waited in silence. Not just to hear a rebuttal, but to witness a moment when the so-called forgotten continent would speak for itself. Not in defense, but in defiance of dismissal, and Traoré was ready. The lights in the press hall dimmed slightly as the cameras began to roll. The silence was thick with anticipation. Reporters from around the world filled the seats, some adjusting their microphones, others simply watching the stage. At precisely the scheduled time, Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. No teleprompter, no flashy production, just a podium, a microphone, and the flag of Burkina Faso draped quietly behind him. He wore his military uniform, crisp and pressed, not for intimidation, but as a reminder. He was a soldier of the people before he was ever a president. His presence was calm, focused, but his eyes burned with purpose. He looked out across the sea of cameras and began to speak. "Mr. Trump," he said plainly, his voice steady, "you said Africa is nothing." The words hung in the air, and the room seemed to tighten. Traoré paused, letting the silence stretch just enough to ensure the weight of the moment was felt. "You said we have no value, that we offer nothing to the world, that we are chaos, poverty, and irrelevance." Then, without raising his voice, without showing even a flicker of anger, he continued, "I disagree, respectfully, but completely." What followed was not just a speech, it was a reclaiming, a recentering, a rewriting of the narrative that had been imposed on Africa for centuries. Traoré began to list names: scientists, engineers, doctors, poets, inventors, all African. He spoke of soil that grows the world's cacao, the minerals powering smartphones, the oil that fuels global trade, the cobalt extracted by African hands. "If we are nothing," he said, "why does the world continue to mine our lands, extract our resources, and exploit our labor?" But Traoré wasn't done. He spoke of ancient kingdoms and civilizations, Mali, Songhai, Nubia, centers of trade and learning that existed long before Europe's modern age. He reminded the audience of Africa's role in the world's religious, linguistic, and cultural fabric. "We are not the cradle of war," he said. "We are the cradle of humanity." The most striking part of his speech, though, was the tone. There was no bitterness, no rage, only clarity, pride, precision. He didn't need to shout because the truth didn't need volume. It needed visibility. Our people are not begging for pity, he said. We are building with our hands, we are learning with our minds, and we are rising with our dignity. We are not waiting for the world to give us value. We know who we are. Then, with a calm breath, he turned his gaze directly into the main camera. To those who still see Africa as nothing, I ask you, with respect, why do you fear what you call nothing? Why do you interfere, undermine, and manipulate what you say has no worth? Perhaps you fear not what we are today, but what we are becoming. The room remained still, no interruptions, no murmurs, only silence and respect. Finally, Traoré closed with words that would be quoted on every social platform, across every continent, by both the young and the old. Africa is not a problem to solve. Africa is not a charity case. Africa is a force, a heartbeat, a future. And whether or not you acknowledge it, we will rise. With that, he stepped away from the podium. There was no applause, not immediately. Just awe. A kind of collective realization that what they had just witnessed wasn't just a political address, but a historic moment. In that instant, Traoré hadn't just defended Africa, he had elevated it, repositioned it, and reminded the world, and its most powerful critics, that dignity doesn't ask permission to speak. It simply speaks, and the world listens. The ripple effect of Traoré's speech was immediate. Within hours, clips from his address flooded social media. The line, "Africa is not a charity case. Africa is a force," was translated into dozens of languages. TikTok was flooded with reaction videos. Instagram Reels featured emotional edits. On Twitter, users from every corner of the globe began quoting him. In Nairobi, a university lecturer paused a class just to play the speech. In Accra, a street artist painted a mural of Traoré in profile, with the words, "We will rise," curling upward in bold red letters behind him. In Soweto, an impromptu poetry night turned into a tribute event. Across the continent, the air shifted. It wasn't just pride, it was relief. Someone had finally said what needed to be said. And yet, it wasn't only Africa that responded. Across the diaspora, in Paris, in Toronto, in Atlanta, black communities gathered around televisions, laptops, and phones. A barbershop in Harlem erupted into applause mid-sentence. In Brazil, Afro-Brazilian activists posted videos thanking Traoré for reminding us who we are. Even in places where African identity had been erased or diluted, his words had found their way in. Elders wept, teenagers reposted, grandchildren translated for their grandparents. It felt, in a way, like Africa had spoken for all of them. Meanwhile, Western media struggled to respond. Some anchors on cable news tried to analyze the moment, treating it like a curious foreign outburst. But they couldn't control the narrative. This wasn't political theater. It wasn't scandal. It was clarity, and people could feel the difference. In think tanks and government buildings, officials began reassessing their tone toward Africa. Quiet meetings were held behind closed doors. Advisors warned that dismissing Traoré would only amplify him. Some feared he was becoming a symbol, a spark in a region already shifting away from colonial influence. One diplomat, speaking anonymously, was quoted as saying, "We underestimated this man, and now we can't control the conversation anymore." Even within the US, the pressure began to mount. Activists called out the hypocrisy. Journalists revisited old clips of Western leaders making careless remarks about the continent. Students wrote op-eds in university papers titled things like "The Day Africa Answered Back." Across campuses from UCLA to Oxford, the speech was dissected and discussed, not for its politics, but for its voice. A voice that had carried centuries of silence and answered it with calm, undeniable truth. And Trump? He did not respond publicly. Not immediately. There were no tweets, no interviews. But sources close to him hinted that he was caught off guard by the backlash, that he hadn't expected this particular comment to resonate so deeply. In private, some say he waved it off. Others say he was irritated by the fact that Traoré's name kept popping up in American headlines, next to phrases like dignified response and presidential courage. Whether he admitted it or not, Traoré had struck a nerve, not just with him, but with an entire worldview that had long assumed Africa would stay quiet. But Africa was not quiet, not anymore. Across the continent, people began using Traoré's speech as a point of reference. Parents told their children, "This is what leadership looks like." Local musicians sampled his speech in songs, teachers included excerpts in school lessons. In Ouagadougou, a woman stood in line at the market and said, "He didn't just speak for Burkina Faso, he spoke for all of us." And that was the truth. The speech was no longer about Trump. It had become something larger, something generational. Some leaders across Africa reached out to Traoré privately, congratulating him. A few even asked for copies of the transcript. Others, quietly nervous, wondered how they would respond if their people began demanding similar strength, similar clarity. Traoré had raised the bar, and many knew they wouldn't be able to reach it. The world had changed in those few days, not because of policy, not because of war, but because of words, because a young man had stood in front of the world and reminded everyone, without shouting, without threats, that dignity doesn't have to ask to be heard. It simply speaks, and when it speaks with truth, the world cannot look away. In the weeks that followed, Traoré didn't slow down. He traveled to schools, to rural villages, to military camps, repeating the message not of anger, but of dignity. "This isn't about Trump," he told a crowd of students. "It's about us, about seeing our value when others don't." And something began to shift. Not just in Burkina Faso, but across Africa. Young people quoted him in classrooms. Elders praised him at community meetings. Artists used his speech in their music. And across the diaspora, Africans in Europe, America, and beyond felt something they hadn't in a long time, a sense of collective pride. This wasn't about political power, it was about voice, about reclaiming the narrative. And as for Ibrahim Traoré, he became more than just a president. He became a symbol. A reminder that one voice, calm, unwavering, and unapologetically African, could shake the world. This is Malik, your narrator, and I've been honored to share this story today, exclusively for Red Beret. If you felt something while listening, if this story moved you, share it. Because this isn't just a headline. This is history in the making. Let the world know Africa is not nothing, Africa is rising.